And joining me now is Evan Siegfried, Republican strategist, and Jason Johnson, MSNBC contributor and politics editor for TheRoot.com, as well as Karine Jean-Pierre, senior advisor for MoveOn.org, and Derek Johnson, president and CEO of the NAACP. And Derek, I'm going to come to you first, Mr. NAACP president. I'm going to come to you first. Roy Moore has a history that I think a lot of Americans who are not familiar with him beyond his 10 Commandments fight are just getting to know. And this is actually clipped through for my producers who are not forewarned. There's a BuzzFeed article that talked about Roy Moore back in 1995 addressing a white supremacist group called the Council of Conservative Citizens. He once addressed the semi-annual national conference of that group, the white supremacist group, that alleged that Charleston shooter Dylan Storm Roof cited as a formative influence on his online manifesto. What should people know about Roy Moore's racial views in addition to what we know about his views on LGBT Americans and on things like monuments and his dating predilections?
Well, the CCC is an offshoot of the White Citizens Councils from the 1950s and 60s. It was also the group that was linked to former U.S. Senator Trent Lott. It is a racial hate group headquartered for many years in Mississippi. The mere fact that he would have been invited, accepted the invitation, and spoke to that group speaks volumes to his empathy or his beliefs around race. He is a racist. There's no other way to put it, because anybody who will speak to that group, espouse their interests or support their platform can be nothing else but a racist.
And let me play for our audience some classic Roy Moore doing his birther thing. This is from December of 2016, and this comes from CNN's Andrew Kaczynski. Take a listen to this.
My personal belief is that he wasn't, but that's probably overdone in a few days, unless we get something else to come along.
And Derek, are African Americans in the state familiar? Do they know this part of Roy Moore's history? And do you think that black voters are energized around this race?
Well, when you look at the history of the South, particularly states like Alabama or South Carolina or Mississippi, this type personality have always been around. And African American, we can identify individuals who hold the same views as a Roy Moore. So I will be surprised if there was an African American in Alabama who could not clearly see through or see Roy Moore for who he is. He is someone that has very little race tolerance. For him, the good old days were the days when segregation was in place and perhaps even slavery, because white supremacy is something that many individuals who are similarly situated as he is in their views truly believe in this concept of white supremacy.
Well, and we should note that, you know, African American voters are about 26% of the voters in the state. Even if 100% of the voters turned out, it's not African American voters, Evan, that are going to determine who wins in Alabama. It's going to be white voters who are something like 90+% Republicans. And, you know, Roy Moore is using something out of the Donald Trump playbook to appeal to them. In addition to denying the claims of being a serial child molester, there is a flyer that was put out that is essentially accusing Doug Jones of doing something that is, you know, really not really controversial, but of him publicly supporting NFL players kneeling to protest the national anthem. So he's going for sort of the Donald Trump playbook.
Well, Doug Jones is supporting the First Amendment and the right to kneel and express one's political opinions. My goodness, we've seen time and time again that Roy Moore has no respect for the Constitution. He himself has said that the Constitution is one set of laws. However, God's law supersedes that. And the Constitution was founded on the exact opposite of this. I've never seen Roy Moore devote himself to the Constitution. He's been twice removed from from the Alabama State Supreme Court for ignoring federal court orders. So he's shown himself not to be there. And one thing that is really disturbing, right now Roy Moore is going on doors, knocking and asking for people's votes. The only reason he should be going on doors is to tell people he's not allowed within 500 yards of a school. And that's the only thing he should be doing right now for Alabama voters. But Alabama voters are saying, you know what, it's okay because we want to get that vote, and Donald Trump's behind it. Donald Trump has opened the door for people to say things that they believed that are not normally acceptable, and it's really moral rot within the Republican Party.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's look at one other. This is a pro-Jones. No, I'm sorry. This is Donald Trump is actually. Let me actually switch to number 6. This is a panel that Frank Luntz did, and Frank Luntz is, of course, a pollster who. You know, he does a lot of focus groups. This is one of the focus groups, and you can hear some voters, some Roy Moore voters, doing exactly what you just talked about, Evan. Take a listen.
Roy Moore is not a miserable man. This man has more integrity than you can find in the entire Congress right now. Don't fall for the George Soros assassination plan. The truth will come out. These women are all going to be proven, just like the 16 that went against President Trump.
So people are essentially not embarrassed about supporting Roy Moore. They're full-throated support of him, and they don't believe his accusers. They think he has integrity.
Well, remember, Roy Moore 2 weeks ago came out and said they are the ones who are doing it. They are George Soros funded. They are Democrats. They are the establishment. The women who are accusing Roy Moore are Republicans who wear MAGA hats. They voted for Donald Trump by their own admission, and now they're being tarred and feathered by their own crowd for having the temerity to actually speak up and say Roy Moore is a child predator. If that doesn't give people pause, then I don't know what will. Yeah. It's very distressing.
You know, it's interesting, and I want to let me come to open this up to Jason and Karine as well. This is a clip that I just saw for the first time last night, actually. And this is Roy Moore talking not just about his views on LGBT Americans, which I don't think will be surprising to people, but also revealing something that, you know, maybe I just haven't been paying attention, his pro-Putin views. So let's take a listen.
To assess what Ronald Reagan would think, I just couldn't simply begin.
But he said that Russia was the focus of evil in the modern world.
You could say that very well about America, couldn't you?
Do you think?
Well, we promote a lot of bad things, you know?
Like?
Same-sex marriage.
That's the very argument that Vladimir Putin makes.
Well, then maybe Putin is right.
And then, Karine, he goes on to speak some pretty good Russian. He sort of greets Vladimir Putin in the Russian language. But it is interesting that he also has this pro-Putin view, and they line up on this idea of being opposed to LGBT rights.
Yeah, not surprising at all, Joy. I think we have to step back for one quick second and remember who had the seat for 20 years, and that is Jeff Sessions. And we have to go back to, if you look back to 1986, Jeff Sessions was deemed to be too racist to become a federal judge. And then 11 years later, Alabama decided that he could be a U.S. senator. And he was in that seat, as I mentioned, for 20 years. And now he's at the Department of Justice, and he's pushing the most rapid and, bigoted, racist pieces of legislation that we haven't seen in a long time coming out of the DOJ. And then the other part about that too is that Roy Moore, in September, when he won the runoff, he was already racist. He was already Islamophobic. He was already homophobic, and still he won the runoff by 10 points. And so, this is all before we found out about him being a pedophile. So this is Alabama. This is the state that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, look at the polls here, Jason. You've got another poll that shows the race locked up. And I'm not sure, what to make of all these polls because they'll show Doug Jones up sometimes. These seem to be more in line with the anecdotal evidence that you're hearing on the ground that Roy Moore is genuinely ahead. There's a Gravis poll that asks, do you believe the accusations against Roy Moore? More people believe them than don't believe them. I'm not sure that that's really hurting him, Jason.
No, it's not, Joy. And look, if you look at the history of this state, I went back and looked, when Jeff Sessions ran against Vivian Figueres, when Jeff Sessions ran against Sanchez, Democrats can't break 40% in this state. They just can't. The fact that Doug Jones is right now around 43 or 44, it's impressive. But think about it. For a Democrat to break 40% in the state, you have to be running against a man who is a clear bigot and an alleged pedophile. That says something about how Alabama voters look at Democrats in general. So, I've always thought Roy Moore was going to win. He's probably going to win by 5, 6, 7 points. And then the Republicans are going to have to deal with that guy talking in the Senate all throughout the 2018 midterms.
And that is the point, Evan, is that if Roy Moore wins, and let's not, call the race before it happens, people still have to vote, but if Roy Moore wins, then your party's stuck with him. And what are they going to do? They're not going to have the excuse of trying to point to the completely different situation of Al Franken and point at him. He's not going to be there.
Good. Because we should judge each case on a case-by-case basis. And Roy Moore still, even if he wins, I don't think they should seat him. It would actually be good for Republicans to stand up and say, we will stand up for women and victims.
They're going to
Cory Gardner's still standing up and saying he shouldn't be seated, and I'm proud of that. Unfortunately, can we get enough Republican senators to do that? No, they're saying, well, we'll let the ethics investigation play out. But my big concern is with ethics investigations is they're toothless. When have they actually achieved results? You have a system built to protect the incumbent. Yeah. And Roy Moore, if he wins, Wednesday morning then first thing will be the incumbent. The one thing I will say that I think Democrats have going for them politically if Roy Moore wins is that it's going to energize more and more women and be a shot in the arm to organize and move for 2018.
Yeah, and Karine Jean-Pierre, it's also going to refocus people's attention on the guy in the White House that's got some pretty serious allegations hanging out there against him, too, and who has inserted himself into this race. Let's listen to Roy Moore's strategist, a guy named Dean Young, who's on This Week on ABC, talking about Trump's role in this Alabama race.
Last night we had Doug Jones, the liberal Democrat, with one of his Senate buddies, Cory Booker, who said that the president should resign. So this is Donald Trump on trial in Alabama. If the people of Alabama vote for this liberal Democrat, Doug Jones, then they're voting against the president who they put in office at the highest level.
So, you know, Karine, you've had Jeff Merkley come out and say that Donald Trump should, that if Al Franken has to step down, Donald Trump should too. Cory Booker said the same thing in Alabama. Are you going to start to hear some of those Democratic women who stood up and said that Al Franken should resign from the Senate if Roy Moore comes in, turn that same vitriol on on Roy Moore, make those same demands of Moore, but also on Donald Trump?
Yes, and that's what Democrats should absolutely be doing, because as they tried to do this week, they now have the moral high ground on this. Okay, if you have the moral high ground on this, let's actually focus on the man who's at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and say to him that he needs to step down. He is a sexual assaulter. We have about more than a dozen women that came out and said this and sound very credible. And if we are in this Me Too movement and we're saying we believe the women, then we should do that. Believe the women and go after the president of the United States, Donald Trump. Leave the women and go after the president of the United States, Donald Trump. And it's kind of, it's really troubling, Joy, that Donald Trump is using the prestige and the power of the White House to give a full-throated endorsement and to campaign for a pedophile. People, for credible, people come out and said he is a pedophile for going after 14-year-olds, for going after teenagers. But then, if you think about it, it's not surprising that Donald Trump, who himself would walk through teenage dressing rooms for beauty pageants, is now also endorsing someone who got kicked out, banned from a mall in Alabama for targeting teenagers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to go to Derek Johnson just for one more question, just to go back where we started this segment. Of course, Donald Trump did give that speech in Mississippi at the Civil Rights Museum. I want to get your comments on the boycott of that event by John Lewis, by Benny Thompson of Mississippi. What did you make of that? Was that the most effective way to respond to Donald Trump showing up?
Well, absolutely. The opening of the Civil Rights Movement was an opportunity to celebrate individuals, many of whom are still alive, their accomplishments, their sacrifices, and neither Congressman Thompson, Lewis, or I were willing to cede the stage to give the president a photo op. There is no commitment to the individuals, the values that they stood for, the fight they took on. You think about Medgar Evers. He was fighting to ensure that everyone had access to voting and quality education. The president don't support that. You think about Dr. Robert Smith and Dr. Geithner through the Civil Rights Movement, who said that access to health care was a civil rights, and they fought and created a rural community health center that still exists today. This president don't support having access to health care for all citizens. So why should anyone give the stage to the president so he can have a photo op only to fight against us with the voting commission cutting funds to support all of the things that civil rights workers fought for? Yes, it was the most effective because we're still celebrating the civil rights heroes. We are talking to them. We're going to have another ceremony, but by no means should we have a photo op for the president.
All right. Well, Evan, Jason, and Karine will be back in our next hour. Derek Johnson, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Are you comfortable that the leader of your party is all in for Roy Moore?
Well, there are a number of people in my party that are not, including myself and many Republican senators.
Senate Republicans may not support Roy Moore, but Donald Trump certainly does. And is he the only one that matters? Joan Walsh is back with me. Also with us is U.S. Republican strategist, Republican strategist Evan Siegfried, U.S. strategist, MSNBC contributor Jason Johnson, and Karine Jean-Pierre of MoveOn.org. All right, I'm going to play for you guys Senator Richard Shelby, who is the senior senator at this point from the state of Alabama. And this was him on State of the Union this morning saying he, in fact, does not support Roy Moore and would rather have a write-in candidate. Take a listen.
I'd rather see the Republican win, but I hope that Republican would be a write-in. I couldn't vote for Roy Moore.
But you're going to wake up on Wednesday, and one of these two men, Roy Moore or Doug Jones, is going to be your fellow senator from Alabama. Which one would you rather deal with on a professional level?
Well, I don't have to answer that question today. I had rather see another Republican in there, and I'm going to stay with that story.
Evan, your thoughts? Is that smart strategy? I mean, first of all, it's a big deal that the other senator in Alabama has essentially thrown Roy Moore overboard, but he wasn't exactly specific about what he thinks voters should do.
Well, I think that voters should probably vote for Doug Jones at the end of the day, because Doug Jones needs every vote he can get.
Why didn't Richard Shelby say that?
Richard Shelby is afraid of the base, because the base could come for him next. We're seeing there are the nationalist roots of the Republican Party who turn on anybody who speaks out against President Trump, because we've gone from being a party about what principles we stand for and policy to a cult of personality. And we criticized the Democratic Party under Obama, saying cult of personality, and now have completely forgotten our own criticism.
Yeah, a cult of two personalities, right. Because let me play you Tim Scott, who we played at the top of this block, saying what the Senate should do if Roy Moore is seated. Take a listen.
Should you guys be looking at the president's accusers as well?
Once again, I think there are two very different scenarios here. One, the Senate has responsibility and oversight over our members. I believe that if he wins, we're going to exercise that responsibility. The people of this country have the responsibility of choosing our president they have chosen.
So, I mean, okay, we do not have a parliament. We don't have a prime minister who's technically a member of parliament. So that's true. But it's not as if the Senate does not have some power here in terms of Donald Trump. Republicans have chosen to do nothing about Trump and not even say anything about Donald Trump. So they have a cult of two personalities, Roy Moore and Donald Trump.
Well, in defense of the Republicans who are like Tim Scott, who are saying that, they recognize that if they go against President Trump, they'll be thrown out of office in a primary and you'll get more Roy Moores. And I don't think we should have more Roy Moores. I think we should have more Tim Scotts. And at the end of the day, it's two bad decisions, but I'd take Tim Scott over Roy Moore any day.
Jason Johnson, does the Republican Party look like it's on its way to having more Tim Scotts or more Roy Moores?
A lot more Roy Moores for some very obvious reasons. Look, I think one of the other things here, Joy, to remember is that Shelby planned this. Right? Like Richard Shelby didn't just figure out this weekend that he doesn't necessarily want Roy Moore as a colleague. He clearly waited until the point where he thought that this statement would be the most effective. And I think it represents the fact that you do have some senators, thank goodness, in the Republican Party. Look, there's two ways you can hold elected officials accountable. You can vote them out, or the rest of your party can say, I don't want you here. They can snatch your chain. They can say, you're not a part of what we want to be doing here. And I'm glad to hear that some Republicans, even those who know that they could be in red states, are willing to make those kinds of statements.
Yeah, but you don't have a lot of fear on the part, Karine, of Roy Moore's camp that he'll face an ethics investigation if he's seated. This is his chief strategist, Dean Young, saying there isn't going to be an ethics investigation if Roy Moore wins. Take a listen.
Would Roy Moore go up there and testify under oath disputing these allegations?
Well, you know, Mitch McConnell and his crew have been threatening Judge Moore from the get-go. They spent $30 million down here trying to beat him in a primary. And then all this fake news from the Washington Post surfaces. Judge Moore's going to go to Washington. Judge Moore's going to win. And I highly doubt there's going to be a Senate investigation.
Karine?
Yeah, I don't blame for the Roy Moore folks to not think that there won't be an investigation. Roy Moore sees himself like Donald Trump. He's using Donald Trump's playbook at every step of the way. And Donald Trump hasn't faced any type of, backlash. He became president of the United States after those 16 women came out. So, of course he doesn't. Of course they don't. Republicans have been completely complicit in all of this for the last 11 months. They haven't done anything to try to stop Donald Trump. So why should Roy Moore think the same? And on Shelby, I'm not giving him any credit at all. How about why did he talk about Roy Moore during the primary, right after he won the runoff? Roy Moore is a racist. He's Islamophobic. He's homophobic. He didn't follow the rule of the law twice, got removed from the judgeship. And now we hear from Shelby. Give me a break.
Yeah, Richard Shelby, Joan could have just talked to Terry Sewell, who is an African-American congresswoman from Alabama. And this is what she said. She says that Roy Moore harkens back to the days of segregation. This is Congresswoman Sewell on This Week.
This candidate, Roy Moore, will only take us backwards and harken us back to the days of segregation, and Doug Jones will take us forward.
Is it possible that Richard Shelby has never had a conversation with her or anyone else about Roy Moore until he just woke up this morning and decided he's against him?
It's possible. I want to clarify something, though. I think he has said before that he's against him. He just hasn't been this clear.
Okay.
Am I right, Evan? I don't think this is brand new. It's just much sharper, and yet it falls short of the one thing that it really needed to say. I'm voting for Doug Jones on Tuesday because he's not a racist. He's not a sexual abuser, molester of young women. I don't like his politics. Maybe he's going to vote for tax hikes. Maybe he's not. But he's a good man.
Yeah.
And this drove me crazy back during the election with Trump, that people wouldn't say vote for Hillary Clinton, the only person who was going to beat him. And now we have people stopping short, sounding really principled and great, and then stopping short of saying, we have to defeat him, so you got to go out and vote for Doug Jones.
Yeah, and you did hear that during the campaign, Evan, that you had people say Donald Trump is temperamentally unfit to be president, and then when asking people what should people do, they'd say, well, write in Mitt Romney if you're in this state, Evan McMullen if you're in Utah. There was never any really definitive vote for the other candidate, even though they're a Democrat. Are Republicans just unable to do that?
Well, Republicans during 2016, we have so many different views. There were more conservative Republicans who didn't like Donald Trump because they didn't think he was a conservative, more like me, who are much more moderate and think that he was just unfit. So to unify behind someone in that instance, much harder. In Alabama, it's much a more clear-cut situation where it's Doug Jones or Roy Moore. There isn't anything else. It's not like you're in New York where it's going to go to Hillary Clinton overall.
And you know, but Jason, you still do have, you know, there was a story out this morning that there's a progressive group that is not going to support, they're not going to support Doug Jones because they don't feel that he's campaigned vigorously enough in the black community. There's this flyer that's gone out that's got some criticism from African Americans. It says, think if a black man went after high school girls, you think anyone would try to make him a senator? There's this ad that came from the Doug Jones campaign. There's a lot of talk that his campaign has been ineffective about mobilizing African American voters. And so Democrats actually, you know, or people on the left are quite, you know, comfortable saying, well, you know what, we don't think he's good enough. He's not perfect enough.
Right. Well, look, Doug Jones hasn't run a particularly good campaign in the African-American community because most statewide politicians don't even really look at black voters except to try to suppress them. So I'm not surprised that he's having that kind of difficulty. But I think, Joy, there's one other thing here to take into consideration. As much as Shelby has come forward and said, hey, I'm a Nevermore guy at the last minute, bear in mind, he and Jeff Sessions were the most anti-Obama voters. He's in favor of the travel ban. It's not like being against an alleged pedophile suddenly makes you a halfway decent person. It just means that you have one line that you won't pass. But again, I don't know if that's going to be enough to help Doug Jones.
You know what Doug Jones should be saying, or even Richard Shelby? They should be pointing out that if Doug Jones ever wins and wants to retain that seat, he's going to have to actually be voting with Republicans 50% of the time. If there are swing Republican voters who are saying, well, I want somebody to vote for Republican issues, Doug Jones is going to be doing it every other time and then some, so he can at least stay in tune with the state. I think it's going to drive progressives crazy, but it's a good message.
Well, and Karine, you know, there's also this issue of, you know, of Republican women, and Democrats have this, you know, if there's another white whale of Democratic politicians and sort of political types, one of them is the white working class, but the other one is white suburban women, and thinking somehow they can be converted over. But just the anecdotal evidence we've seen, Vice News went out and did a bunch of interviews. You've had Frank Luntz go in and do focus groups. It doesn't seem that Republican women in Alabama are being moved against Roy Moore.
No, it really doesn't. It really is playing just like 2016 of last year, of November, where it didn't matter. The Access Hollywood tapes came out. You had Donald Trump talk about how he treats women and how he sees women, grabbing them by the genitalia, and he got, what, 53% of white women voters. And I wish I had an explanation for that, but it's just that it's the same thing, kind of replaying that again.
All right, lightning round again, and we are, you know, no time left, so I'm going to make everybody predict who wins this election, Moore or Jones. Karine Jean-Pierre.
Joy, look, it's Alabama, and we've talked about the history of Alabama. I think Roy Moore is going to squeak this through.
Jason Johnson.
Look, Roy Moore is going to win unless some like R. Kelly tape comes out with him. He's got this.
Top that. Let's go to you, Joan. We'll make Evan close. Go on, top that.
I can't top it. I'm going to say Doug Jones squeaks it out just because my heart needs that.
Okay. All right. It's Sunday.
Okay.
It's Sunday.
It's Sunday. I'm not in church,
prayer.
But
yeah, let's go ahead with Evan.
sadly, immorality is going to win, and we're going to have a child predator in the Senate.
Wow. All right. Well, Joan Walsh is going to be back. Wow. With that, thank you very much, Evan Siegfried, Jason Johnson, and Karine Jean-Pierre. Great panel.